cooperation agreement. To be clear, Cohen's description of those efforts of helping the special counsel is overstated in some respects and incomplete in others. Is there tension between the special counsel and the Southern District's office?
Chuck, you want to take that first? Oh, go ahead, Joyce.
I would just say no one would be surprised if the Southern District of New York, which we sometimes lovingly call the Sovereign District of New York, had a little bit of tension with other prosecutors' offices. But the likelihood here is that Cohen may have cooperated differently with the Southern District than he did with special counsel. He may have had more sensitivity when it came to his personal financial dealings. Right. And so they would likely have different assessments.
And they likely also had more leverage over him. His family, it was a family business. He could have had family members involved with the Southern District. Rev, you spent time with Michael Cohen. Did he know this was coming?
I think Joyce hit it right. I think that he would not be surprised. He, as I stated before, I've met with him twice. The last time he asked me to pray with him, he said, I'm going to jail. Yeah. I think the question was how long and how severe. But I don't think that he's surprised. I think his lawyers are not surprised. I think he knew, particularly if he had never made the agreement, I think he knew he was looking at jail time. It was how much he could shave off. And I think that's what we're beginning to get some idea of.
And I throw this question to Chuck and Joyce, and I'll just say Chuck just because Joyce answered the last question. Chuck, is one of the just central key differences here between these two is that between the Flynn case and the Cohen case is that Flynn cooperated immediately, early, right out of the gate, and that Cohen was late. The difference here is, one of the big differences here is between early cooperation and late cooperation.
Flynn was immediate, it was fulsome, it was timely, and it was therefore substantial. Cohen was later and less. But look, to the earlier point about tension, there's always tension. DOJ is a big family. But in the end, it's a family, and they're going to reach one point of view. It's articulated in this document.
All right. I'm going to thank Joyce, Chuck, Ken, John, Mara, the Rev, and Rick. That doesn't mean this is the last you're going to see of them, though. Chuck is going to pick up all of our coverage right now. Hi, Chuck.
How you doing? 1 down, 2 to go. We got one memo in.
Enjoy it. I get popped on my desk.
What are you talking about here? This is what I've been doing while you guys have been talking.
Have a good show.
Gotta love it. Thank you, Nicole. Good evening. I'm Chuck Todd here in Washington, and as I've been showing you, we are going through all these various memos. We got the first one in, 2 more coming up, so buckle up. We are expecting all 3 of those crucial court filings to be public in this hour. We have the one that Nicole and company have been chewing over for a few minutes, and it appears that we just got another one. This one from Bob Mueller's team and the federal prosecutors. That focuses on 2 key witnesses in the Mueller probe, Michael Cohen and Paul Manafort. It'll be interesting to see if the special counsel's office has a different view of Michael Cohen in sentencing than the Southern District of New York. You've already got a preview there. The Southern District of New York doesn't want to give too much credit to Mr. Cohen and his cooperation. Let's get right to our NBC investigations reporter, Tom Winter. All right, Tom, I've done my best to digest Memo 1, and it appears the Southern District of New York is saying these are serious crimes. Michael Cohen only started cooperating after he realized he was in deep trouble, and he should get some credit, but not a lot of credit. What else are you learning in this memo?
Yeah, so, Chuck, as far as anybody expecting here that we're going to learn more about what Michael Cohen may have said to prosecutors in the Southern District of New York, and his attorneys had said, Chuck, that there was a separate ongoing federal inquiry in New York for which Cohen was being helpful to federal prosecutors, making it clear here that that's not really the case. He hasn't been very helpful at all. They're saying that they're not going to offer what's called a 5K. So, Chuck, a 5K is what might typically be put in a file. If I was cooperating in an investigation and I signed a formal cooperation agreement and I was kind of handing everything over and providing new information, providing new leads, and going deep into my criminal history, that's a big part of this, then I might expect a 5K where the government says, hey, this guy has gone above and beyond where he needed to go to really help us out here. And, Your Honor, we're really asking you to take down any sort of imprisonment or any sort of sentence that we may want to normally see imposed here. As a matter of fact, Chuck, they're saying the exact opposite. They're saying that he did not want want to go into his criminal history. He did not want to go beyond the things that he was charged with. He didn't want to go beyond the payments that were made to Stormy Daniels and Karen McDougal, two individuals who have alleged affairs with the president. He did not want to go into any sort of criminal activity that went beyond that. In addition, federal prosecutors in New York are saying that he did not want to go beyond any of his prior criminal history, which is interesting, which might lead us to believe that, in fact, that there are other things that federal investigators in New York might be interested in. One thing I do want to point out, though, is that they did say in their one meeting with him, he only had one meeting with federal prosecutors in New York, according to their filing, is that they did find him to be generally truthful and somebody who was generally credible. So they didn't kind of dump on him as a witness, potentially long term. They just said, hey, look, as far as the totality of the cooperation that we think he could have brought, it wasn't all there, which leads us to the next filing, which is the one that hit literally as you were starting to speak on the air, which is a filing by the special counsel's office. I'm going to take a look and read into that right now, Chuck, and see there whether or not he provided more information to Robert Mueller's team that could have been helpful.
Well, and in fact, and we're going to find that out in a minute as soon as we get that. Let me go to Mimi Rocha here, obviously a former, an MSNBC legal analyst, a former assistant U.S. attorney of the Sovereign District of New York, as we've heard it jokingly called. Danny Savalos is also part of my legal panel here, MSNBC legal analyst, and Frank Figluzzi, an MSNBC national security analyst and former assistant director for counterintelligence at the FBI. So, Mimi, is this, how much input would Bob Mueller have had in the memo that was written by the Southern District of New York? Or because this felt like a rebuttal to Michael Cohen's filing, period. Would it have incorporated Bob Mueller's recommendation or not yet?
Well, Chuck, interestingly, since you started by jokingly referring to it as the Sovereign District, I think that's actually appropriate here. Look, the Southern District has its own case against Michael Cohen. And while we as a country may be more interested into how Cohen's cooperation fits into this broader national inquiry that's going on about the president, et cetera, they're in front of a judge. And Judge Pauley, who I've been before many times, is not a judge that, to not take very, very seriously. And so they have to deal with the circumstances and the facts of the case that they are litigating. And right now they have a defendant, Michael Cohen, who did not sign a cooperation agreement with them. And I think they're being as straightforward and transparent as they can be with the judge. I haven't looked at this in enough detail yet, but just based on Tom's summary of it, they're saying, look, he didn't cooperate with us. We wanted him to give us more information, and he would not do that. However, he cooperated with the special counsel and was truthful there. Now, the reason for that dichotomy, why Cohen is cooperative in one and not the other, I don't think we know yet. And there may be more to the story, but I think they're laying it out for the judge, which is the best you can do as a prosecutor, as the government, is say, here's the facts. Right. This is where we are. One case he didn't cooperate, one case he did, and he was truthful. And my guess is, I'm totally guessing that Robert Mueller's office was allowed to read over this submission, not to have a yay, yay or nay in the final say of it, but just to make sure there's nothing in it that reveals anything that they wouldn't want revealed. But beyond that, this is the Southern District's case, and they're laying out the facts with regard to Michael Cohen as best they can for Judge Pauley.
Danny Savalos, you're not just playing a defense attorney here, you are a defense attorney. Let me read you this one graph specifically from the SDNY's memo here. While Cohen's provision of information to the special counsel merits credit, his description of his actions as arising solely from some, quote, personal resolve, as opposed to arising from the pendency of criminal charges and the desire for leniency, ignores that Cohen first reached out to meet with the special counsel at a time when he knew he was under imminent threat of indictment in this district. As such, any suggestion by Cohen that his meetings with law enforcement reflect a selfless and unprompted about-face are overstated. You've read, I know, the filing that Michael Cohen's attorneys put in a few days ago asking for that leniency. You've heard that. What do you expect a judge to do with those basically two different versions of belief of what the cooperation looked like?
what a study of contrasts between Michael Flynn, Michael Cohen, and then maybe at the other end of the extreme, Paul Manafort. And Michael Cohen is the example of a defendant who has cooperated some, but not quite enough to warrant a 5K1 motion or the substantial assistance that can reduce his sentence so significantly. Last week, when Michael Cohen's attorneys filed their memorandum, they did a good job of creating an atmosphere where it sounded like Michael Cohen was the picture of cooperation, that he had rushed in to cooperate and that he should be getting the same kind of benefits that Michael Flynn got. But the government today was quick to counter that and make absolutely clear that while he helped some, he didn't help and rise to the level of that precious 5K1 motion that federal defendants seek when they cooperate that can have a huge effect on the final sentence. And that means that the government here is being reasonable in the sense they're asking for a guidelines to below guideline sentence, but that's not as good as life could have been for Michael Cohen had he fully and completely cooperated.
Frank Verclusi, you've probably dealt with this before, where you've got somebody who's extraordinarily cooperative for you on one instance. Another law enforcement district says, yeah, but, you know, this guy's done nothing for me in my investigation. Walk us through those little agency-to-agency fights or district-to-district fights, if you've ever gotten into them.
I certainly have, and the Southern District of New York has played in many of those conflicts and tensions. And in an ideal world, Chuck, you want cooperation and coordination amongst all the agencies and all the various prosecutive entities. So in an ideal world, you're all at the table. You're saying, let's prioritize our missions and goals with this defendant, and let's try to rank order the degree of cooperation, and let's try to prioritize who's got kind of a more important thing going on here. That's really hard to do when you've got 500-pound gorillas like the special counsel and the Sovereign District of New York, to use the phrase, sitting at the table, if they even sit at the table, and we're not sure of that yet. So it should surprise no one that Cohen and everyone surrounding this president is in it for themselves, is trying to make the best deal, have it both ways, try to protect their personal interests while squealing or snitching on someone else. That's not a surprise to anyone based on what we know about Cohen and the Trump associates. What is slightly surprising is the apparent lack of coordination and one sheet of music. But I'm waiting to hear more from what the special counsel is going to say in his filing.
Well, that's fair. And Mimi, I'm curious, you know, when I look at this one part on page 16 of the SDNY's filing, and it noted that Cohen further declined to meet with the office about other areas of investigative interest. Is this also an invitation? Is this basically saying to Michael Cohen's attorneys, well, if you will sit down and sign this agreement and basically lay it all out on the table, maybe we can talk again?
Right. So first of all, I just want to clarify something. I don't know that we should start reading this as a break between the SDNY and the special counsel's office. You know, this actually may be more coordinated than we think, in the sense of he does not have a cooperation agreement with the Southern District because he didn't. Well, we don't know why exactly, but he doesn't have one.
So I guess, is this pressure? I mean, I guess that then
right.
Then maybe.
And so to your point, though, that opportunity is not. That door is not closed yet.
Okay.
Okay.
Yes.
So once he is sentenced, and my guess is he will get prison time. How much, we don't know. But, you know, I think it will be, quote, substantial. I mean, again, Judge Pauly is, you know, not a judge that is known for light sentences. But, you know, he is going to get some credit here, and he should get some credit. So, but even once you're sentenced, there are procedural mechanisms written into the Federal Rules of Criminal Procedure that allow a defendant to cooperate post-sentence and get further credit to reduce the sentence. And that could go a really long way here. So absolutely the door is still open. Michael Cohen is represented by Guy Petrillo, who knows this, you know, inside and out. Right. And we'll see what happens.
Let me pause the legal analysis here for a minute. Tom Winter, you've just poured through Mueller's first memo. I think we're expecting 2 from him. What did we learn?
So, Chuck, just to piggyback off of Mimi's point, I think it's important to note that this isn't necessarily a break here. There's not a fight between prosecutors in the Southern District and the Special Counsel's Office. They're two discrete investigations, and so the Special Counsel's Office is providing a little bit more detail here as far as how Michael Cohen may have been helpful to them. I want to read this kind of an important section here, and I'm just going to read off the screen. It says, the defendant, who's Michael Cohen, also provided information about attempts by other Russian nationals to reach the campaign. For example, in or around November 2015, Cohen received the contact information for and spoke with a Russian national who claimed to be a, quote, trusted person in the Russian Federation who could offer the campaign, quote, political synergy and, quote, synergy on a government level, end quote. The defendant recalled that this person repeatedly proposed a meeting between individual one and the president of Russia. We know, Chuck, that individual one to refer to the president of the United States, Donald Trump. The person told Cohen that such a meeting could have a, quote, phenomenal impact, quote, not only in political but in a business dimension as well, referring to the Moscow project, because there is, quote, no bigger warranty in any project than consent of, in parentheses, the president of Russia. Cohen, however, did not follow up on this invitation. So that's interesting, Chuck, because it appears that Cohen was approached in November of 2015, which was obviously quite early on in the campaign, and you would know this better than I, but quite early on in the campaign, that there was somebody in the Russian government or somebody well-known, well-trusted in Russia that suggested some sort of a political synergy as well as a business synergy. The memo goes on to say, Chuck, second, Cohen provided the Special Counsel's Office with useful information concerning certain discrete Russia-related matters core to its investigation that he obtained by virtue of his regular contact with company executives during the campaign. Third, Cohen provided relevant and useful information concerning his contacts with persons connected to the White House during the 2017 to 2018 time period. Fourth, Chuck, Cohen described the circumstances of preparing and circulating his response to the congressional inquiries while continuing to accept responsibility for the false statements contained within it. The conclusion says that the defendant's crime was serious. Remember, this is only referring to his lie to Congress. The defendant's crime was serious both in terms of the underlying conduct and its effect on multiple government investigations. The sentence imposed should reflect the fact that lying to federal investigators has real consequences, especially where the defendant lied to investigators about critical facts in an investigation of national importance. However, the Special Counsel's Office notes the defendant, who's Michael Cohen, of course, has made substantial and significant efforts to remediate his misconduct, accept responsibility for his actions, and assist the Special Counsel's investigation. Accordingly, the Special Counsel asks or submits to the court that they should give due consideration to Michael Cohen's efforts set forth above, which is what I just read, and that it would be appropriate to allow the defendant to serve any sentence imposed in this case concurrently with any sentence imposed in his other case, the one that we've been talking about for the last couple of minutes. So basically, what they're talking about, Chuck, is that if he's going to serve a period of, and I'm just going to propose a hypothetical or an example, say he gets sentenced to 4 years in prison for the New York case, that if he's, say he's given 2 months for lying to Congress, that he serves those 2 months at the same time. In other words, he's not going to do four years in the New York case and then another 2 months. So that in layman's term is what it means. But it's clear here, Chuck, that Cohen did provide some information about some attempted efforts or contacts that were made by people that are associated with Russia, and we need more details about that, but we're not getting any more from this document. I will note that there are no redactions that I have found in the 7-page filing by the Special Counsel's Office.
In either document. In fact, can we lift up here a minute, Tom? I want to go big picture here before I get into the legal back and forth here. Let's take big picture and information that we've actually gotten in both of these filings, okay? The first filing, which is the Southern District of New York, for what it's worth, this is basically the heart of this investigation is the Stormy Daniels, Karen McDougal payments, the women that have allegedly had affairs with the president when he was a private citizen, and the attempts to buy them off, cover them up. I should point out in this filing, it says in particular, and as Cohen himself has now admitted, with respect to both payments, he acted in coordination with and at the direction of individual one, which we know is the president in all of this. As a result of Cohen's actions, neither woman spoke to the press prior to the election. That's not an insignificant finding here, Tom, is it not?
Yeah, it is, Chuck. So it's more explicitly saying what was in the criminal information, and it's saying essentially what Michael Cohen allocated in court back in August of this year, basically saying, hey, I did this, all these payments at the direction of the president. And he stated that back then, but I think it got a little bit lost because it wasn't quite explicit in the criminal information in the court paperwork that he pled guilty to at the time. Today, I know that exact paragraph that you're referencing, it directly draws the line. Cohen is essentially saying here, hey, those payments to those two women, the ones that I'm in trouble for now, the ones that I pled guilty to, that I may go to jail for, yeah, the president told me to do that. And I think it's important here at this point, Chuck, to say, well, you know, for folks that may be watching us saying, well, wait a minute, isn't the president on the hook for some legal exposure there, from some criminal legal exposure? And basically the way it's been referred to me, Chuck, is that if the president was in any other position in government, if we were talking here about the mayor of a city, if we were talking here about a governor, we would be talking here about somebody who would eventually be testifying against that person in court. They would likely be charged by directing this payment. But again, we have a situation here where it's Justice Department policy where they don't charge a sitting president. That's probably the only reason why here we're not looking at us talking about an indictment or a pending indictment involving Donald Trump. That's really the only reason why, as it's been explained to me.
All right, Frank Faguzzi, I want to bring you in here a minute because there's another part, and Tom Winter, stick with me. We got a lot of detail, Frank, in the Bob Mueller memo about the Moscow project. And then, and it goes through specifically, and Tom walked us through. And then it notes 3 other areas where Cohen was cooperative, and it feels like the yada yada episode of Seinfeld. They're leaving out a whole bunch of stuff here. It just says this. Second, Cohen provided the special counsel with useful information concerning certain discrete Russia-related matters core to its investigation that he obtained by virtue of his regular contact with the Trump Organization. Third, Cohen provided relevant and useful information concerning his contacts with people at the White House. Fourth, Cohen described circumstances of preparing and circulating his response to the congressional inquiries. Bottom line, Frank, it feels as if they're saying, he told us a lot of information, but we're not going to tell you what he told us.
Yeah, so this is redaction without the black magic marker.
Yes.
This is deliberate vagueness. And I think we should look at this as significant for 2 reasons. One is it was worthy of mention. Mueller wanted those things in there specifically without black magic marker covering it. And then go read to the bottom on the last page where it says, I'm okay if this guy basically serves any time concurrent with Southern District of New York time. So I would view this as fairly significant cooperation. There's 2 other things that Tom read that I'm focused on. One is Mueller's reference to Cohen cooperating regarding preparation and circulation of his statements before testifying to Congress. That's a big deal. That circulation part, who did he give his prepared comments to? What timing was it? Was it the White House? Was it Trump dictating what he should say or not say to Congress? That's a big deal. Second thing, he cooperated regarding a Russian making overtures back in 2015. That is almost worthless information unless it's part of the bigger Russian puzzle that Mueller needs, and we'll hear about it later, or it wouldn't even have been in there.
Mimi Rocha, that the 4th point in the memo, what Frank just talked about, this idea, the circulation, isn't that a neon sign screaming obstruction of justice?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it sounds like what we're talking about is someone, whether it be 1 or 2 or more individuals, coordinating with Cohen about the false statements he was going to make. And, you know, that would be obstruction. It could be, I mean, there are all sorts of statutes you could charge it under, but it would be a crime. And Chuck, can I add to one point?
Please.
I know we're jumping back, but
that's okay.
Back and forth. But
we're all trying. I'm trying my best to keep us somewhat organized here, but it's coming in fast and furious, and we know it exactly.
And you know, so the point I was going to make was about the campaign finance charges and the now more, as Tom said, more explicit implication of Trump in the crime that Cohen pled guilty to. We sort of knew this. You know, Cohen said it. It was in the information. Now it's explicit. And the point I want to make is that if the government is saying it in its sentencing papers. And the way they said it is, if I remember correctly, is now that Cohen has acknowledged, right? So this is something the government can prove, that Trump was part of this campaign finance scheme, that he helped direct it. That's huge. I mean, again, he's the president, so he's probably not getting charged. But this is not just Cohen's say-so. So Trump can call him a liar, but this is about evidence that the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Southern District of New York appears to have. And that, to me, is extremely significant. I mean, we are not talking about one person, former lawyer, who he's going to call a liar. And
this would be calling the United States government a liar, is what you're saying.
Yes, which Trump surprisingly does as well. But we're talking about we're talking about evidence, and that's something that we have to keep coming back to. That the things that the Southern District, that Mueller, that they are talking about are not just statements based on belief and spin. They're based on evidence and facts, and we still don't know all the evidence that either the Southern District or Mueller has, and neither does Trump or Giuliani. So every time they say they have nothing on the president, they can't say that because they don't know what they have, and every day it looks like that evidence is stronger and stronger.
Danny Cevallos, after reading both memos, if you were representing Michael Cohen, would you go back to him and say, buddy, go do the full, go just throw yourself on the mercy of the Southern District and give him everything? If you really want to stay out of jail, or if you really want to minimize your sentence, your only shot is you better come clean with more stuff to the Southern District, because they're clearly not happy.
The biggest revelation of today is the notion that the government is still possibly interested in working with Michael Cohen. Last week, when Michael Cohen's attorneys filed his sentencing memorandum, they left the impression that Michael Cohen had done all the cooperating that he needed to. That was rebutted today by the government. And the thing you might expect is that the government would be offended at the notion that Michael Cohen would assume he was entitled to the kind of substantial assistance reduction that a 5K1 motion brings. But yet they are still leaving that door open for him. And if I was representing Michael Cohen, I think a lot of defense attorneys would go to Michael Cohen and say, if you're going to cooperate, don't cooperate 50%. That doesn't work for cooperators. You have to cooperate 100%. The challenge is for defense attorneys is that often they are told about 80%, maybe 70%, maybe 50% by their clients. But only the client and maybe the government knows 100%. And I think it would be time to say there's no point in cooperating halfway. As Mr. Miyagi says, cooperate all the way. In the middle, no good.
Tom Winter, I know you wanted to jump back in here. You've got some more for me.
Yeah, so Chuck, I know at the top of the show you referenced that we're going to be getting 3 filings today. We've gotten 2 of them. The judge ordered that the sentencing memos in the Cohen case from both the special counsel's office as well as the federal prosecutors in New York, both of those were due by 5 o'clock. Everybody behaved. We have them. We've been talking about them. But the third was going to be a filing about the alleged, quote, crimes and lies that Paul Manafort committed while he was in the process of cooperation after he pled guilty back in September. We've just got to notice the judge has ordered that the special counsel's office can, what we call, leave to file. Basically, they want to file something under seal. So we're going to get a certain portion of what Manafort did, or at least a reference to it, out in the open, which we can share with you once that is filed. It hasn't been filed yet. But we now do know for sure, we've been hearing this afternoon, that that a significant portion of this would be redacted today as far as what Paul Manafort would be up to. We now know that a significant portion or an attachment to this filing regarding Paul Manafort is going to be, in fact, filed under seal. That means we won't be able to see it. Only a federal judge, obviously Mueller's office, and Paul Manafort's counsel will be able to see that filing, and obviously Paul Manafort himself. So we now know that at least some of the details as far as what Paul Manafort's been up to that's led to a break in that plea agreement, we're not going to see those publicly today, and I just wanted to update you on that. The second thing is just going back to something that I read before, and federal prosecutors never waste a word. I have learned in my career. They say that the defendant also provided information about attempts, plural, by other Russian nationals to reach the campaign, and they provided that example that I read to you, Chuck, and I think it's important to note that. So it appears that there may have been more than one attempt by Russian nationals to reach out to the Trump campaign, and they detailed that one back in 2015. That means if Michael Cohen told anybody about that attempt in 2015, by the time we get to July 2016, and that infamous Trump press conference where he says, you know, Russia, if you're listening, it means at that point there had already been 8 or 9 months that they have known that Russia wanted to engage with them. I think this changes the timeline, to my memory, perhaps significantly here, Chuck.
I agree. And look, before I turn to the political fallout on this, I want to get from our 3 legal experts, do any of these two memos at all, Mimi, let me start with you, do they give you a sense of where Mueller is in his investigation? Is he still in the investigatory stage? Is he still, you know, where, do you get any sense? Could you read the tea leaves at all in here to know we're getting closer to the end, or, you know what, let's stop trying to figure this out? Mimi?
I haven't actually read the memo, but based on the summary we're hearing, I think that, yes, I think Mueller is still in the investigation stage in the sense that he's still putting the pieces together, but has so much evidence, I think, in a way that, frankly, I'm not sure I even really understood until recently, in the form of hard evidence. And that's why I think he can, you know, he can really tell when people are lying, and what, you know, he knows the truth. And I think the truth is going to come out. And that's what, you know, I think set off this tweet storm this morning from Trump. I think he's sensing that too. Right. I think the other point, the just big picture point I would make that this is bringing home to me is this idea that the business and the political interests here are so intertwined. And we've been talking about this, you know, since Cohen pled guilty, and we heard about the Trump Tower Moscow deal going on at the same time as the campaign. I really think that the link between those interests, Trump's business interests, and what happened with Russia is starting to become clearer, and we're going to see that come more into focus, and that's central to what Mueller's doing.
Frank, what's your sense of how much Mueller knows, how far along Mueller is? I mean, it was to get to those last 3 sort of redaction in plain sight, you know, redacting without redacting. Does that tell you, man, this guy's got so much more here, or he's still got a long way to go in how much information he's trying to get? Because I don't get the sense that the special counsel needs more information from Michael Cohen. The Southern District of New York would like more time with him, but it sounds like the special counsel doesn't need more time with Michael Cohen.
Yeah, so I agree. I agree with Mimi that we're not yet at the end. I don't think it's going to be long, though, and here's why. The references today by Mueller to, first of all, let's talk about that circulation and preparation. He's looking, that's obstruction. So if anybody's questioning whether or not Mueller's going to go there, whether he's going to buy into this argument that I can't touch you for obstruction, or I'm not going to, he's going there. That's clear. Secondly, on the Russia front, these vague references to discrete information about Russian activity, et cetera, this means that Cohen is corroborating what Mueller already has. That's my read of this. I think he's got it. I think Cohen served the purpose of saying, yes, it happened on my end too, and I think that's where we're going with this.
Danny, your final thought on that as well. How much do you feel like you understand the Mueller probe today more so than you did yesterday?
I think no one understands the Mueller probe more today than they did yesterday and then the yesterday before that. 2 pieces of evidence suggest to me that Mueller isn't quite done yet. One is the Flynn sentencing memo and all of its redactions. And then today, you have the unredacted redactions that suggest that there is still investigation that needs to be protected. And for that reason, while Mueller may be sort of wrapping it up in the grand scheme of things, I think there still remains a significant amount of investigation to be done.
All right. I'm going to let you guys take a breath, read some of these memos. I know you guys want to read them yourself rather than having Tom and I read them to you. I get that. Digest it a little bit. I know if more comes, we're going to be back to you. But let me bring in the political side of this discussion in the political panel tonight. Carol Lee, NBC News national political reporter, Cornell Belcher, Democratic strategist and MSNBC political analyst, and Daniel Pletka, the Vice President of Foreign and Defense Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute, also an NBC News contributor. Welcome all. Let's talk about the new things we learned today, Carol. And the reason I say this is that there's new pieces of actual information. Number one, the government has stated for a fact that the president directed Michael Cohen to pay off these women. Okay, there's always been, you know, there's no more ambiguity there. Nope. That is a fact. But the 2 big parts of the Mueller investigation, I can pull them both. I'm going to put up these quotes from the Mueller. This is from the Mueller sentencing memo. Cohen provided the special counsel with useful information concerning certain discrete Russian-related matters, core to the investigation that he obtained by virtue of his regular contact with company executives during the campaign. Company, in this case, is always Trump Organization. They said that at the top. And then let me pull the second one here. Cohen described the circumstances of preparing and circulating his response to the congressional inquiries while continuing to accept responsibility for those false statements contained. So we know that an obstruction of justice charge is being pursued, and pursued, it looks like, rather aggressively. And there's a lot more Russia contact.
It also makes that that Don Jr. Trump Tower meeting statement and the efforts to kind of create some sort of false narrative there seem a little like small ball, because this is actually very serious. And we don't know who, but they circulated this to, who was involved in that. But clearly, there's a history of willingness to do things like that among people in Trump's orbit. The other thing, Chuck, that stuck out to me is that there were that this was the first mention that I can recall where Mueller points to 2017, 2018. Trump's time inside the White House. And, we don't know exactly why, but that's pretty significant. And if you look at that and add on the 2015 Russia contacts, the time frame of this has just really kind of expanded from what we were initially kind of operating in terms of when we thought things may have started and when the investigation was running up to. This has 2017 through to 2018.
Danny Pletka, this is just, there's no sugarcoating this on behalf of the president. I can't, I mean, the government is basically alleging that he's obstructed justice.
So I was actually asking myself as I was listening to all of this and reading really fast these many pages, what the Trumps would say in response to this, what the president's defenders would say. And I think what they're going to say is, Mueller went into this looking for collusion in the election and how Donald Trump stole the election. What does this have to do with that? Sure, he paid off through his lawyer some sort of bimbo. That, I think, is going to be, I think it's the only possible defense.
It's the only spin that they got.
Isn't it the only possible?
Because they don't want any of that. The Russia stuff looks so so like they're afraid of something.
Right. So we understand now that we all thought that there would be a new Donald Trump who would come into the White House and behave differently. In fact, not only was there not a new Donald Trump, there was the same Donald Trump pursuing the same business interests with the same sleazy tactics and the same scummy group of people around him, all of whom remained there.
Two things strike me, and one actually hits home because I'm not a lawyer. I work in politics. I work in campaigns. And campaign finance laws, Chuck, they're not suggestions, right? The government,
not supposed to be.
The government thinks that the president has done something that if he were not the president, if I had done them, Chuck, they would prosecute me and they would put me in jail. I want that to sink in for the American people right now, right?
Anybody listening right now, every single person, as Tom pointed, a governor, a mayor, a senator, anyone
and
at
it
this
challenges
point.
our idea that no man is above the law in this country. So we actually do have a big conflict right now in our democracy because apparently a man is above the law because I would be prosecuted and thrown in jail.
Fair point.
The other part about this is that I think will strike even more anxiety with the American public is, do we have a Manchurian president? Right? Clearly, the Russians were trying to buy, influence, and compromise him. And whether or not they did, we might not know. But, Chuck, if you look at the way this president has behaved towards Russia, not like a Democrat and not like a Republican ever has behaved towards Russia, the American people have to be a little bit more anxious about what, in fact, they've done.
Let me bring in Ari Melber here. He's the MSNBC, obviously, chief legal correspondent, host of The Beat. And, I don't mean to take away your lead and your time here, but I want, instead of playing host, I want you to play analyst for me. Maybe Mueller isn't proving collusion, but there certainly was attempted. He has found out all of these attempts by the Russians to find leverage inside Trump world.
Absolutely, and I'm happy to be with you, Chuck. Not worried about our A block on The Beat, but there is a lot of news here in these filings. In listening to you and your panelists, I think the Manchurian question hangs over all of this. What we're seeing Mueller do and the way that he expertly deployed the prosecutors in New York is bad cop when it comes to Michael Cohen's sentencing. 4 years, heavy, big
fine, $500,000. Yeah, $500,000 fine, I believe. Yeah.
And then the Mueller filing that we see with regard to Michael Cohen is good cop because it doesn't actually ask for any prison time, and then as a legal matter says to the extent that he gets any, it would be basically served at the same time or canceled out with whatever he gets in New York. So that is really a nice reaction from Mueller to Cohen for what he gave. What I think Mueller is telling us tonight that we didn't know even an hour ago is that Michael Cohen did provide very material information about Russian money and how Russian money and Russian sourcing, as referred to in this filing, is a part of Bob Mueller's investigation. So for people who thought 6 months ago that the whole thing would hinge on whether or not there was election hacking that involved the Trump organization, yes or no, and that tells you the outcome, Bob Mueller at this stage is clearly willing to put everyone on notice that a big part of this might be business or financial leverage, which he is asserting in court under the penalty of perjury is core to his investigation.